Hey, what's up, and welcome to the channel. My name is Michael, and I am a Second Temple Jewish literature junkie and a big-time Bible nerd. I also, while I'm not the most experienced by far, do have some experience with apologetics and have even argued and debated with some pretty big-time atheist influencers. And so that's why I wanted to make this video, which is on apologetics, and not just the different little apologetical arguments that we make as Christians and as atheists, but also just actually more so our overall approach to apologetics, our methodology. Because if we just argue on every little point itself, then we're not getting very much of anywhere. But if we talk about our methodology and why we're thinking the way that we're thinking and how we're even getting to the conclusions we're getting to, then we don't have to argue so much on a million different whats. And I want to make this video not only about atheists in ways that I think that they could improve their own apologetics in places that I think that they're misunderstanding Christianity, but also for Christians who I think oftentimes misunderstand their own faith. And so that's why I actually first want to begin with Christians and critiquing us Christians, because I'm one of us. And so that brings me to my first point, which is base your apologetics on your theology and don't base your theology on your apologetics. In other words, we should not have to philosophize about who God is and think about all these different arguments apart from the Bible and our already understanding of God. Instead, an even better and more effective approach to apologetics is to just study theology for what it is, not even to defend our faith. And I found that for myself, just studying the Bible, seeing the primary sources and scholars and what they said about the Bible and how they've thought about it, I've been able to not just better articulate my faith, but why I believe in it. And instead of coming up with a bunch of counter attacks and rebuttals to a bunch of these different arguments that you might hear from atheists or other non-believers, I've had a more holistic understanding of Christianity and of my own worldview. So when these atheists could come with this counterpoint or this counterpoint or this or this or this, I can instead just come to them and help redirect them and guide them to show them what that text or that theological doctrine is actually trying to say. This is also just more beneficiary for yourself because you can better understand who God is, and that can help you in your own personal relationship with Him. And in the end, we need to be thinking about not just how we're going to win them over, but what would happen when we do win them over. Because if we're arguing first on philosophy and ideas and arguments that we haven't even based on right theology, then when they do get potentially won over, what are they going to be asking except what do you believe? Why do you believe it? How do you come to these conclusions? And they're going to be wrestling with all these problems that are going to be posed with what you taught them originally in your apologetical arguments. And so what we need to be doing is actually defending what we really believe in. And then when they do come to place their faith in Christ, potentially, we can explain to them the faith that we were already defending in the first place. And then the second point that I have is that we need to argue on the basis of the Bible. We first need to argue for the Bible, and then we need to argue on the basis of the Bible, and then the surrounding cultural context. In the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, Jesus says pretty much if they don't listen to the prophets, then they're not going to believe in somebody who's come and resurrected and comes to talk about the afterlife. What he's saying actually in its original context is more talking about that parable and rich people and people who are already so like full of themselves not wanting to listen to somebody who's even had this crazy miracle because they aren't willing to listen to the original prophets. That I think should inform also our apologetical approach. Because really, these people aren't going to believe in Jesus and what he did and who he was if we don't first show them how the source that says who he was and what he did is actually reliable. And you can actually do that by pitting it up against the sources of its day and even how we think about those. Because the Bible is not just indoctrinating people. In fact, on the other hand, it's providing a very nuanced theological opinion. Another problem that I see with people who argue based on the Bible is that, sure, they got the first part right, is they argue based on the Bible, and so I'm agreeing with that already. But then they don't argue based on the Bible in its original context, but they try to drag it into our own context and make it mean things that it doesn't really mean. And that's the difference between meaning and significance. It's about what does the Bible and its authors want to say versus what can I make it say. And so we see people like, for example, Ray Comfort, who can use the Bible to prove the top 10 or the top 20 scientific never known facts until we read the Bible. Like that the life is in the blood. And if we draw blood today, well, we can find out all these different things, but that people in the time of the Bible couldn't find those things from reading the Bible. Or that the Bible talked about quarantining because people who were unclean and had diseases had to be kept away from other people. Or that the earth is actually round and not flat, and that the Bible talks about this and saying that the earth is a circle. First of all, I'm just going to take apart those three arguments to show that those are just wrong in general. And these are actual arguments that I have heard from Ray Comfort on Living Waters. First of all, as for the life being found in the blood, what the Bible is saying there is not some scientific truth. This is the pre-scientific, so as to say. Well, one could really argue what science is in the first place. But this is a pre-scientific text. And so what it's not trying to provide is physics for us and teach us that, you should be taking people's blood because then you can find out all of these things about their health. No, what it's actually saying is a more metaphysical truth, which is an entirely different idea altogether. It's saying that it's about the meaning and that blood represents life. And that's why, for example, on the 4th page of the Bible, we see that God has to bring justice to Cain because the blood of Abel is crying out to him. As for the quarantining, it's funny that he even brings that up because the idea of clean and unclean, while it did, for example, pertain to leprous people and people of all types of different skin diseases, it also pertained to people who, maybe they just given birth or went through their menstrual cycle. And those things are not, as we know, contagious. And so it's talking about ritual purity and cleanliness versus our concept and idea of quarantining people who are just sick, because it was quarantining more than just sick people. And then thirdly, circle is two-dimensional, it's flat, and it's not round. The Bible being about a flat earth is a totally different video that I plan on making later, but yeah, the Bible most definitely did not believe in a round earth. And that's why it talks about a firmament being made on the first page of the Bible. And instead of talking about that firmament being destroyed on the 7th and 8th page of the Bible, instead it actually carries through to the end and multiple times refers to that firmament even afterwards. And this all brings me to my last point for Christians. And that's really that we should just be arguing with the original nuance that we find in the Bible. For example, a very common atheistic argument against Christianity is that God cannot be all loving and all good, and at the same time all powerful and all in control. And while I think it's safe to say as Christians that God is both those things, we can't go so far as to say that we have the answers, all the answers as to why all this evil is here. Sure, we can go so general as to say that it's because of our sin in general, because of the failure of Adam and Eve in general, that evil was brought to this world in the first place. We cannot go so far as to say for individual circumstances. In fact, the Bible itself argues against this opinion. You see in the 3 major wisdom texts, we have Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. And while Proverbs tends to say, principally and generally, as an aphorism, and not really as a just, this is always how it is, those who fear Yahweh and do righteousness and good and justice will have good things coming their way, whereas those that do evil and wickedness will have evil that come their way. But that's just one of the 3 majors. And the other 2 actually seem to argue against that. Job says, well, we can't actually know why bad things happen to us. In fact, in that very story, a lot of us who read this say, oh, well, God was obviously testing Job. And so we do know that's one of the reasons why sometimes bad things happen. But we really can't tie it down because, for example, even in the book of Job, Job never knew what was happening in the divine council. Job never knew about these encounters between the Satan and God. Even at the end, God doesn't explain himself. In fact, all that God says is, I'm all powerful. I'm dealing with all these factors in the world and in the cosmos, and there's no way for you as a human to look up at me and judge me based on that. And so we can argue in that same way. God is in control of everything and we don't understand everything, but we cannot go so far as to say give specific this is what caused this and this is what caused this, when the Bible itself is cautious, not just cautious to stand against that, but even putting tension on that and saying, hey, all these other friends of Job who are trying to nail it down and say this is why this bad thing happened are wrong. And then even Ecclesiastes goes on to say that even when we're following Yahweh, life seems purposeless and it seems like hevel or mist or vapor that just fades away. And so we should really be arguing with that original nuance. Again, having in the back of our mind the idea of when we win them over, potentially speaking, how are they going to go ahead and believe our original arguments and then come to believe in a totally different theology? Or if we are going to win them over with these arguments that make things super clear and explain things that the Bible didn't explain, didn't care to explain, and doesn't simplify like we do, how are they going to make sense of that? How are we supposed to help disciple them and lead them in understanding that if we already helped them misunderstand that in the first place? And so the Bible is a very nuanced text, and there are a lot of things that it doesn't want to explain. And if it doesn't want to explain it and it doesn't go in depth, neither should we. Or at least if we do, we should be very careful so as to say, hey, here are some ideas that I have, some philosophies, but I really can't know for sure. Now, as for the atheists, I have a couple of problems with some of the apologetics that I see done. One of them that I see is atheists oftentimes, and this isn't just atheists, just like the ones for Christians aren't always for Christians, but they mostly are. Atheists, sometimes I see arguments against the believers rather than the belief itself. I've even seen this in a philosopher, a psychologist that I respect really, Jordan Peterson. And he says, if God really is real, then why are his people like this? Jesus says that we are supposed to be known as his people by our love. However, Jesus also calls us to be perfect people. Christians may be surprised to hear this, but that's what Jesus says. He says, be perfect as my heavenly Father is perfect. And the fact of the matter is, while there are very few people who are at very few times perfect according to the original language of that verse, teleos, which means just living up to your asymptotal existence, living up to your total potential, while there are very few people that at very few times live like that, the truth is a lot of us don't live up to that standard. God did call us, he makes us Christians, a royal priesthood, a priesthood of believers, as Peter says. But even with the people of Israel that he elected and that he chose and that he called and wanted to come to himself to be his priesthood of believers, he had to, on their behalf, compromise and actually say, well, since you're only going to let Moses go up to Mount Sinai and y'all aren't going to come up, you guys can't be. And so they fail there. And the priesthood fails. Aaron's a pretty not that good priest. The priests after really aren't that good, besides maybe Phineas. And then the kings are all just horrendous. I mean, David's good, but even he screws up some. And then Solomon, who's like the wisest king, even he just goes big time all out in sin. And so the Bible itself is actually more critical of its own people than we'd like to be comfortable with, even as Christians. But that's the truth. And even when we're coming to this from an apologetic standpoint, if you're trying to disprove Christianity, then argue against Christianity. If you're trying to disprove these Christians and who they are, then sure, argue against them. What you're really doing is you're actually just disproving that these couple Christians live up to what they believe in. You're showing that they don't live up to the standards of the Bible and they don't live with faith. But what you're not proving is that that faith is not in something that's actually real. So, like I said, argue against Christianity and not against the Christians. If what you're here to do is to prove that God is not real, then prove that he's not real and not his people. The fact of the matter is Christianity is, at least according to what people claim, the biggest religion with, if I remember correctly, about 2 billion followers. So the fact that there are like hundreds or even thousands of people who just totally fail to live up to it should be at the very least expected, especially that since like even over time, it's the most universal religion of all time. And speaking of judging, my second point is that we should be judging the Bible according to its cultural context and not according to the contemporary context. For example, I see very often arguments against, oh, how is God just if he gives this law? And why did God not speak up against this? Well, let's take, for example, why did Jesus not speak out against slavery? Well, let's have you go out and speak against whatever you think is wrong. Say it be abortion or whatever rights or whatever you believe in. Go ahead and say that to people who are wrong. Remember that God speaks to people in their cultural context. This is just the truth. Whenever Jesus is arguing with the Pharisees over whether or not someone should be able to just divorce their wife just because they don't like them, what he says is, well, actually, this was not how it was in the beginning. Moses allowed you to write a certificate of divorce because of your hardness of heart. God was not commanding, he wasn't giving them commandments that he claimed were the perfect, if you do these, you are the perfect person. But rather, what the claim was, if you live by these standards, then you are going to live in a way that is different than all the other nations. And so instead of comparing their laws with contemporary laws, we should be comparing them with the cultural context of those laws, which is ancient Near Eastern laws. So compare it with Hammurabi Code, with the Babylonian, Assyrian, Egyptian, all the other Mesopotamian laws, and see how it lines up with those. Because what you'll find out actually is that these laws are just so much more just and ethical, even by today's standards, than those other laws. The truth is, I see a lot of atheists argue, they'll be like, oh, well, like if God is giving the perfect law, why today do we have it so much better? Well, think about your sons down to 1,000 years, and they're surely going to be looking back at you and be like, oh, these people are so unethical. They do this thing. They just assume that this was right, but this is terrible. Why did nobody stand up against this at this time? And we all have these things in our generation. And there are things that it doesn't matter. You can say, I'm open-minded to this or I'm open-minded to this, but there are just things that we oversee in general. It's not just about us overseeing these things, but it's God understanding that and communicating his truth to people in that stance. And so the Bible is not saying that the Torah is completely perfect. In fact, it was a common law and it switched. For example, in Exodus, right before the Israelites are about to head into the land, God says that they should cook the meat quickly and not boil it. But then in Deuteronomy, right before they actually enter the land itself, and this is the second generation, not the Exodus original generation, he says, do not roast it, but actually boil it. So it switches. That's not because it was like rewriting the law, the other law was unjust. But what it is saying is that according to your cultural context, according to the time, this is how it's going to be. Because when they were first fleeing Egypt, they had to do it quickly. That's the point, and that's what it makes mention of. Versus Deuteronomy, it's a completely different time, and they can celebrate the whole festival in a whole different type of way. And so again, we should be looking at these laws, these histories, these stories, always reading them in their context. And that means not just understanding them in their context, but comparing and judging and putting our standards with them according to their context. Because if we're going to read them in their context by the conventions of that they wanted to use and the way that they wanted to use them, then we should also be judging them according to that same context. The third criticism I have is actually in one way actually an encouragement. And that encouragement is that the Bible poses a lot of the same problems that you guys pose. The Bible doesn't use those same problems to disprove God. It uses those problems to actually say, hey, God, to challenge God, but not to disprove him and write him out. For example, Habakkuk, sitting in the time of the exile, is wondering, why, God, are you giving up Israel into, Israel's pretty bad, but these are some nations that are pretty horrendous, Assyria and Babylon, they're pretty disgusting. And, Job and Ecclesiastes and the prophets, a lot of these nations, they have prophets in their courts that are going and saying, yeah, King, you're awesome. You'll do well. You're such an ethical, just person. Go ahead and take over this empire. You'll do great. And, Israel had those prophets, which are the false prophets, according to the canonical prophets, who are actually outside that preaching, doing some pretty ridiculous stuff, eating food that's cooked over dung, lying on their sides for over a year, just doing absolutely ridiculous stuff. And they're preaching against those people, and they're saying, hey, you guys are screwed up. And so the problem of evil, the problem of why followers of Yahweh don't live like they should, all these problems are actually problems posed by the Bible itself. And they're problems to struggle with. And they're not just posed by the Bible, but they're posed by those who have read the Bible and meditated on it the whole time, by church fathers, by Second Temple Jews. This has not been ignored. In fact, it has been touched on in a way that no other religion of its time or place, or even after around it, has ever dealt with it. In one way, what I'm saying is, your argument doesn't disprove God. But in another way, what I'm saying is that doesn't mean disregard it and don't ask that question, but rather look at what the Bible says. And I know this isn't everyone, and I'm not pushing this on anyone. Again, these are just generalities, all these principles that I'm giving. But I know that there can be a lot of emotional hurt and damage from the church and from Christians and followers of Yahweh in the way that we treat other people and even other followers of Yahweh. However, what I do want to say is when you are in the heat and you're sweating and it's so hot and you're dying of dehydration, so often you can get this desire and think, oh man, I just want out of this so bad. And you just plunge your hand into a cooler full of ice. But if you pay attention, you're actually getting a cold burn. And so what I'm saying here is, coming out of those really rough experiences, we can want to just jump real quick into the exact opposite extreme. But that actually just causes more damage. And so I actually want to apologize on behalf of us Christians. I know that I myself have been wrong multiple times. I've used fallacious arguments, but I've also mistreated other followers of Yahweh and other atheists and people. And so, I apologize there. And I know that's probably not going to mend very much, but I hope it means something, that this is the way that I want to do apologetics, and this is how it should be done, is honestly and with humility, and coming to the text, both of us, on our own terms.